Okay, welcome to the SumerSports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm normally joined by Thomas Dimitrov. Thomas will be back Monday after his absence over the past 5 or 6 weeks or so. It'll be pretty fun to chop it up with him. We're still sort of deciding what we're going to talk about Monday because this week I'm going to cover a lot of different topics in this show today. This has been a heck of a week from the perspective of the NFL. We've had a decent amount of discussions kind of going into the week about running backs and sort of how to measure their value that happened over the weekend because of a tweet by my colleague Kyle Shanahan, and then some sort of responses by members of the fantasy community, which were kind of interesting. We've also had discussions about running back value because of guys like Josh Jacobs, J.K. Dobbins sitting out training or mini camp, and some discussions about the draft and its role in this entire thing, and there have been other sort of aspects of this as well. We're going to talk a little bit about linebackers and play action and things like that because of some really interesting comments by George Kittle. We're going to let some people sort of roll in a little bit into the chat room. We really appreciate you coming in on this day here. So, okay, let's talk. I'm going to talk just a little bit briefly about some of the discussions about running backs, just because it was, in the fantasy community, a community. I'm not going to be, I'm not going to sort of sugarcoat it. A community that's not necessarily as statistically literate as maybe more the sports analytics community. Seth, when Dalvin Cook got cut, tweeted out a graph of expected points added along with rushing yards over expected, and there was some discussion about how good that the rushing yards over expected was because it didn't sort of stack players as well as some of the maybe conventional wisdom would have. And I think that this sort of does reveal a little bit of in my opinion, the innumeracy a little bit of the fantasy community, in the sense of a lot of guys are just sort of making rankings and stuff. Now, this isn't everybody, of course. People like JJ Zacharyson, Josh Hermsmeyer. There's a lot of good statistical analysis there, but there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding of what modeling is there for. And, RYOE is not going to stack running backs perfectly for a couple of reasons. And this is actually in my book, which is coming out, I believe, in August. We talk about this in every single residual analysis. And when I say residual, I mean you take the outcome of the play, which in case of rushing yards over expected, it's rushing yards. And you subtract from that the expectation. In theory, the rushing yards have embedded into it the skill of the player and the situation that the player is given when they run the football. And the expectation is simply the table that is set for the player. And so that difference, that residual, is in theory the talent of the player. Now, that we know can't always be accomplished. And things like completion percentage over expected. We know that guys like Patrick Mahomes engineer throws that are easier for them to complete than other players do, right? We remember that Sunday night game in 2020 in Las Vegas where he was rolling left, moves the whole defense with him, throws the ball across his body to Kelsey. Kelsey's wide open. That play is going to have relatively little completion percentage over expected because he engineered a throw where the accuracy was trivial. But that doesn't mean, of course, that it was an easy throw, right? And so I think in any residual analysis, you're going to have to ask the question, how much of the running back skill is embedded into the expectation? So for something like rushing yards over expected, you can imagine if the running back is good, let's say Dalvin Cook historically has been thought of as good. For example, the number of men in the box, that could have something to do with how good the runner is, right? So if the runner goes above and beyond that or below that in expectation, we may not be capturing the skill of the back. Be that as it may, rushing yards over expected does a much better job of predicting rushing yards one year to the next than rushing yards do. So it's not a perfect metric, but it's better than what we have or better than what we had. And so I think that not to kind of, not to be a jerk about it, but if, to require perfection out of a metric, to me, is a little bit of a revealing, trait. It means that you sort of don't understand what statistics are here for. Statistics are here to improve upon our previous understanding of where we are, not to be not to be a perfect representation of the world, right? If we had a perfect representation of the world, we'd use that, right? The reason we model is because we don't and we can't. And I think, in my book, which like I said, is out, you can go order it on Amazon. Just, search for my name in Amazon. You can go ahead and pre-order that for the fall. We talk about that. Like, as the league evolves, you have to evolve these models, or else you're going to be left in the dust. So that was, an interesting discussion topic. I think Tage caught himself in some, got caught in sort of the brush fire there, because he's an analyst. And the fantasy community, there's not a ton of intersection between true analysts and the fantasy community. That was a little bit of a weird interaction here. Matt has already pre-ordered. Come on now, haha. Yeah, I appreciate you, Matt. I'm excited for you guys to be able to read that. I think Sean also gives an interesting topic. He says fantasy production does not necessarily equal actual points. That is absolutely true. But just something to think about. By the way, just to plug not only this show, obviously subscribe, rate, review for those of you who are listening now, or those who listen on the podcast. I will, by the way, we've got some really good feedback. We will be putting timestamps on this particular podcast, which should go out Friday night, the 16th. But also, if you go to SumerSports.com, go to the Zone, you can actually subscribe to what will be our newsletter that will be coming out relatively soon, and will be there for you throughout the weeks, throughout the season, throughout the draft season, free agency, training camp, all of that with us at SumerSports. So go ahead and get signed up. Be one of the first to do so. And we are going to continue to publish great articles like this. This was Tage's article on who is this year's lead quarterback. Again, you can find this at SumerSports.com, as well as you can find this podcast there. Tage, talked about sort of, what are the markers for quarterbacks you can expect to take a jump from one year to the next? Because there always seems to be one quarterback that does that, right? Last year was Jalen Hurts. The year before, a couple of years ago, you had Mahomes. And then obviously, it just kind of every single year you have one guy that kind of leaps into the MVP conversation. Tua last year as well. So sometimes there are multiple of them. The question is who is it this year? Is it Jordan Love? Is it Justin Fields? Go ahead and go read that article if you want to get an idea of who could be the next great quarterback in the NFL. Kudos to Tage Seth for writing that up. We will, by the way, be having more articles on the website, as well as some tools as the fall approaches. Okay, one thing I wanted to talk about, because this became a big topic. James Trotter said something about, running back. The football is the only sport where salary is tied to position in any sort of meaningful way, and it affects negatively running backs. Now, that's not necessarily true that position is, in other sports isn't necessarily tied to salary, but in the NFL there are explicit ways in which that happens, and the key one, of course, is the franchise tag, right? The franchise tag, is by position, and sometimes it is artificial in the sense that obviously, like linebacker, defensive end, there are, sometimes there's a distinction without a difference. Sometimes there's a huge difference. If you're talking about a 3-4 defensive end versus a 4-3 defensive end, there's a big difference between those two players. You're looking at off-ball linebacker versus edge-type linebacker, 3-4 outside linebacker. That's a huge difference as well. There are things that get grouped together. For example, offensive line are all in one franchise tag grouping, and that can affect sort of how players are given money. In the case of running backs, it gives a fairly good deal to teams that are going to franchise tag running backs. Right, about $10 million or so for the exclusive tag. I'm sorry. And that, Saquon Barkley has that. He's been sitting out. Josh Jacobs has that. He's been sitting out. Tony Pollard has that as well. He'll be his first year as a starter, even though he'll be trying to go for his second 1,000-yard season as the Dallas running back, because he eclipsed that last year in a reserve role behind Ezekiel Elliott. So it does. And whereas wide receivers, you rarely see wide receivers get tagged. You rarely see left tackles get tagged. You rarely see some of these premium positions get tagged, because they are, it's really expensive. You rarely see quarterbacks get tagged. You do see it sometimes, Cousins and Dak and so forth. And it brought up an interesting question because to solve the running back value issue, you really have to sort of go down to the studs of how this league is structured, right? Because you have players get drafted, and since 2011, we have a predefined rookie deal for every single position in the draft, and for the first 32 picks or the first round picks, depending if a team loses their first round pick in a year, that's 4 years with a fifth year option. That fifth year option changed in the 2018 CBA, but that number is generally speaking a fairly reasonable one. And then after that, you have second rounders getting a certain amount, third rounders getting a certain amount, and for the most part, they're all like 4 years, mostly guaranteed. And it gives rise to this thing where guys like Jacobs, guys like Pollard, Barkley. Now Barkley and Jacobs were both first round picks. In the case of Jacobs, didn't get his fifth year option exercise. Like that first 4 years is like prime earning potential for a running back. And the issue is like no rookie, other than maybe the very, very top picks, and even them, they're not getting a ton of money. They're not paid a lot during those first 4 years. And those first 4 years, if you're a tackle or you're a defensive end or you're a tight end specifically, if you're some of these positions that age more gracefully, it's fine because you get a second contract. You generally speaking are in the prime of your career when you sign that. But for running backs, they're not. They're oftentimes are never more valuable than right when they get into the league. And the problem is like unless you get down to the studs and actually change that structure, in other words, take away the rookie wage scale or take away the contract structure of rookies in the NFL, you're always going to have this running back problem because you're not. If you were to say like, okay, running backs, like let's say you said something like running backs get paid more per their draft slot, or you did something where there was a differential in like quarterbacks get paid a certain amount per pick and running backs get paid a certain amount per pick. Do you think that teams would ever draft running backs high? No, because it would just simply not be worth it because you'd get more surplus value drafting a position that had a lower rookie wage scale price. So you have to get even further, I think, down to the real generating process of this, which is the draft itself. And, one of my good friends, Arif Hassan, mused the other day on Twitter about whether we should have a draft in the first place. And I think it's important, sort of to ask that question, a very fundamental question of why do we have drafts? And is it necessary for us to have them? And I think it takes us all the way back. So, I'm 37 years old. I was born in the 80s. Like I've, read quite a bit about the NFL, but the 80s to me, you can get a really decent idea of where this all comes from that decade, because the decade of the 80s is when, guys started really exercising their earning potential or some of their power, right? Because in the 1980s, you had the upstart USFL, which was a 3-year league. And it's not like the USFL now. We're going to talk about some USFL games at the end of the week because this is the final week of the year. And all the games mean something, I think, except for one. So that's kind of cool. But in the 1980s, the USFL was a real actual thing. It was very much like the live golf without the money that happened in the 80s. And they went after, Steve Young. They gave Steve Young a 40-year, $40 million deal. Now they put it all in an annuity. They went after Jim Kelly. Jim Kelly was drafted in the top 15 picks by Buffalo. He goes to Houston and plays for the Houston Gamblers instead of going to play for Buffalo. Herschel Walker, now this was an interesting one because Herschel wanted to go out of Georgia after 3 years. At the time, you had to basically be a 4-year player to go into the NFL draft. So Herschel went ahead and went to the New Jersey Generals and played with Doug Flutie for Donald Trump's New Jersey Generals and played there for a few years. You also had Reggie White going and playing for the Memphis Showboats. You had Anthony Carter playing for the Michigan Panthers. Bobby Hebert, my friend, who I do a radio show with out of New Orleans sometimes, he played for the Michigan Panthers as well. And so there was real, actual power there. 1982, right before the USFL started, there was a player strike. There was only 9 games in that year. 1987, there was another player strike. And Out of 1987 came what was called Plan B free agency, which basically was like every single team could leave unprotected a bunch of players, and those players were actually free agency. That was the first time in the NFL that there was actually player movement. And so that was the first time free agency was ever even a thought process. The draft, of course, predated that by multiple decades. And I think that that's kind of the idea is like you go to teams and the team controls you. And over time, we've chipped away at that idea, right? We've chipped away at it, again, Plan B free agency. And then in 1993, there was actual free agency. In 1994, there was the salary cap. And we've just kept the draft around as a relic. And we love the draft. The draft is an amazing thing. PFF, Timo, and large extent Timo, and then I helped a little bit with the mock draft simulator. We love that. We love that stuff. But the draft is very much a relic of a time where players didn't really get to choose where they went, and we've chipped away at that for veterans. But I think if we really want to tackle the problem of, what running backs are paid or what other players are paid, we really have to get down to the draft, right? We really have to get to this point where what if it was an auction? What if they were all just free agents and you had a pool of money to sign those players that was commensurate with maybe your position? Maybe you got more money if you were a weaker team. Maybe you don't get the first pick, but you get the dollars allocated like a first team with the first pick did, or something like that. You would need to have something that would mimic being able to dole out cash to these teams, but you had to but in some ways you got to give the players the opportunity to choose their teams. If you allowed for that, then you could think about a situation where, and this actually did happen before. I remember the Vikings, growing up in Minnesota. I remember Robert Smith, he only signed a 2-year deal coming out of Ohio State. So he was drafted by the Vikings in the first round of the 1993 draft, signed a 2-year deal, and held out, because he was a restricted free agent, held out in 1995 until he just sat out all the training camp and then came in and was the starting running back. And that's great. He ended up getting his, and then he got his again. And then, finally he had one of the, when he retired, surprisingly, he was one of the more highly paid players, not among his position, but in the whole league. And again, running back value was a little higher back then. But I think if you give players the opportunity to sort of sign those deals, then maybe quarterbacks, maybe you can go in and sign quarterbacks to longer term deals, and then sign running backs to shorter term deals, sign tight ends to longer term deals, and sign, let's say, safeties to shorter term deals, linebackers, positions that are less valuable to the market right now. I think that would help, right? And it would help with development too. I always talk about this, but the Packers had to give Jordan Love kind of a weird little deal as opposed to exercising his 5th-year option, because it was totally different than what it was when Aaron Rodgers was coming out of Cal. When Aaron Rodgers was coming out of Cal, they gave him a 5-year, $7 million deal. That 5th year was a team. That he wasn't an option year. So when he got done with 3 years, the Packers still had 2 years at a $1.4 million per. And so when Rodgers blew up, in the year 2008, they gave him a modest starting contract, and that worked for everybody. That was a good deal, and eventually Rodgers outplayed that and got more money. But he was able to be developed. Now it's like with a guy like Jordan Love, it was almost like you got to shit or get off the pot. And maybe some players need a longer developmental curve. A guy like Zach Wilson, I think, would probably benefit from a deal like that, versus some other players. Who, like running backs, like if Josh Jacobs could have gone back to the table after 2 years with Vegas, he probably would be better off than, of course, now where people are like, great, he led the league in rushing. But when you look at age curves among running backs, is it a great gamble to go in on him? The answer is probably no. But same thing with tight ends. Like you look at David Njoku actually stayed with the team that drafted him, but for the most part, all these other tight ends, Evan Ingram, TJ Hawkinson, I'm trying to think of OJ Howard, all these tight ends who were drafted high, they end up playing for another team before they ever break out. And, you would imagine, that's why this year there were a lot of great tight ends in the draft. There was only one, Dalton Kincaid, that was drafted in round 1. And that is because of, sort of the basic strategy in the NFL draft of you don't draft tight ends high because they, generally speaking, don't give you the return over the time that you have team control. So I'm not saying abolish the draft. I love the draft. I think the draft is a great event, but I'm also pro labor. And I think that in this, there is, some reason I think to not have, sort of this thing that artificially suppresses some positions and not others. Like, I'm very much analytical. I'm going to tell you the truth about running back value, but I'd love for running backs to get theirs, and for them to get theirs. I think what you need is for them coming out to have shorter term deals. And I just don't know if you're going to have that in a draft setting where if you made the contracts differential on positions, teams are just going to pick differently, right? And you're going to get the same outcome for running backs, I think. But if you abolish the draft altogether, maybe you would have a more free market sort of idea there. So that's just something to think about. Let's go with some comments. We got some really cool, we have John here from a 30,000 foot view. You see the league changing some rules to rebirth running back production. There has to be a tipping point for the disparity, it feels. Yeah, I mean, look, I think we already saw that a little bit this past year. Yards per carry was up. It was a good running back season. It was a bad quarterback season, relatively speaking. A lot of that was because of the too high that everybody ran against Kansas City and found out that worked against other teams. Of course, it stopped working against the Chiefs because the Chiefs traded the reason everybody was doing too high in the first place and went in a different direction because Andy Reid is such a genius. So you saw more running. I don't think it changes any of the biological facts of age curves and things like that, though, that really do affect the position. Matt Ungashek, frequent listener to shows, thinks Seth Kaiser. Seth's great, by the way, a lawyer out of Minnesota, also a Chiefs fan. Had a smart comment. He mentioned the value. Pretty good, very good elite running back brings a very good running back room is insignificant. There's a lot of pretty good running backs available. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the whole, that's the Dalvin Cook, Alexander Madison thing. I don't think anybody in the world thinks Dalvin Cook is worse than Alexander Madison. I think what they think is that if you can get $9 million by getting Dalvin Cook off your books and only have to pay 2 years, $7 million to Alexander Madison, the differential on the field between Madison and Cook is not as big as the differential in the pocketbook. And so, a guy like Kwesi, good friend, he's going to make that decision. And that's just dollars and cents. Again, don't don't hate the player, hate the game, right? Like if you're not a fan of what's happening to running backs, let's think about changing the league rules so that running backs can get their due. I'm perfectly in favor of that. Dean, great show, love that. Thank you, Dean. Mojal, middle ground could be to shorten drafts to 3 rounds and rest for free agents. Absolutely, and that's the one thing. Like the problem is we saw that with Alan Hearns, right? Alan Hearns was drafted or not drafted. I'm sorry. La'el Collins was not drafted. And, they were pretty good coming out of the gate. Alan Hearns got a deal from the Jaguars after 2 years. I would love to see that for every single player. I think that, of course, as somebody who's a Kansas City fan myself, like, obviously I love the fact that Mahomes becomes a MVP candidate in year 2, and he can't go immediately back to the table and ask for a $50 million deal. Like, that's great for the team. It's bad for Mahomes. I think that should be the case for every player. They should be able to go back to the table. Now, that hurts with team planning and everything, and frankly, everything we're doing at Sumer when it comes to modeling stuff. But it would make for, I think, a better labor market for the players, of course, so that everybody gets paid their full market value. Exactly. That's what we're really trying. I mean, with the salary cap in place, that is going to be hard, but you are going to get more of your fair market value if you were to have something like abolish the draft altogether, or to your point, have the draft be shorter. That makes a lot of sense. There was one comment on Twitter today that said, look, like if you got away with the draft, no one would go to places like Green Bay or I'm trying to think of Cincinnati, Indianapolis, places like that. I reject that wholeheartedly. For one, players go where they want to go because of money and other situations. Like Reggie White, when he left Philadelphia, went to Green Bay, he said God told him to do it. Who knows? The motivation notwithstanding, like guys go all kinds of places. And, the salary cap would do away with a lot of the like you could only really sign one huge pick a year. And then you'd have to be fairly, diligent after that. But I don't foresee that being an issue. I don't foresee every player going to New York because they don't do that in free agency either. And they don't go just to Florida because there's no state tax or whatever. Like they just simply don't do that. One thing that I think that the rookie wage scale has done for the draft, though, and to be quite frank, it's a good thing for the draft. It's a bad thing for the players. Is if you watch old drafts on YouTube, a lot of times when you get there, you know who the first bunch of picks are because they've already negotiated their contracts. You look at baseball, it's the same thing. Like part of the calculus of whether or not to draft a player in the first round is whether or not they'll sign. And so that gets out, and that makes the draft a lot less compelling. Imagine if we knew the first 5 picks of every draft, you wouldn't log on and go to ESPN or NFL Network or the SumerSports draft show until later on, and that's obviously bad. So there are a lot of competing factors, and we have to be able to name them and talk about them before there's any change. But that's an interesting tidbit to add there as well. Here's a question, Nicholas Pierce. Thank you for the question. Would there ever be enough push from the NFL Players Association to try to get different contract lengths? There should, but the problem is the NFL Players Association is a terrible union right now. For one, they don't fight that well for their players. I mean, players can't hold out anymore. They can hold in, but they don't hold out anymore because they get fined an astronomical amount. So even, one of the things that players had in their back pocket was to sit out games and sit out practices. And they negotiated that out of the last CBA in 2018. Like, this is a bad union. And so, yes, in theory, the union can fight for the players' rights. They never really have for the last few years. So I color me skeptical that they will. A question: will your team ever make standalone videos based on the articles on your website? Yes, absolutely. That is part of the plan. Right now it's basically just us trying to decide what we want to do. But yes, absolutely, there will be all kinds of content on SumerSports.com coming up during the season. By the way, I want to talk about an article that Tage Seth and I got published. For people who don't know my background, by the way, I was a college math professor. I published 25 or 30 math papers or scholarship and teaching and learning papers. I left academia in 2018. I kind of published a little bit of the work that was leading in, and I've done a lot of work in sports analytics, but because of industry demands, we don't publish them in academic journals. Well, Tage Seth and I actually published or got this article accepted this week, investigating trade-offs made by American football linebackers using tracking data. This was using some PFF data because I was at PFF when I started this research, and tracking data, which for everybody that's looking is basically the XY coordinates of every single player on the field during the course of a play. And basically what we're looking at, which is going to tie into the last thing I want to talk about today, is basically on play action plays, how much do linebackers move over what's expected? Again, talking about residual metrics as we were before. So like, for example, on first down, you expect players to flow against play action more than they would on third and long. Looking at all those, and looking at how linebackers bite. So you had biters like Zach Cunningham was a biter. You had Mizzou 2003. Don't forget an elite college tight end. I wouldn't say elite. I would say a very serviceable Division II tight end was me in the past. But thank you for the kind words. So you had this thing, and this is what we published in the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference in 2022, which is this idea that there are linebackers who retreat on play action, and there are linebackers who bite on play action, and that's a characteristic. And what was really fun to watch was, teams like Chicago with Matt Eberflus, you could see how Bobby Okereke and Darius Leonard worked with play action, and that was what he ended up preferring in TJ Edwards and Tremaine Edmonds when he was going to get linebackers in free agency, and what he didn't prefer when he traded Roquan Smith to the Ravens. So there's these cool traits that you can derive from tracking data, which is awesome. But what we then wanted to do was look at actually how much did linebackers flow to the run. So basically, we looked at the distance between the runner and basically box players. Well, we included safeties in the box in the analysis. And what was really fun was players that bit on play action were also players who were strong flowers to the run, and players who didn't bite on play action were very much players who were a little bit hesitant to the run. So if you're watching the podcast, here's the graph that's in the paper. On the x-axis, you have how much ground you covered over expected in run plays. So if you were better that way, you were going to be worse at biting on play action. And if you were better at not biting on play action, you were worse at ground cover. Now, there's some players that broke the mold. Players like Fred Warner, players like Bobby Wagner. The best player at breaking the mold, the guy who flowed really well against the run, but also didn't bite on play action? Dante Hightower. I don't know if that's Bill Belichick just coaching him really well or him just having those instincts, but that was one where it was really cool to see that there was literally a trade-off. So when you think about this world, this football economy, there's a trade-off between having a Zach Cunningham who flows really well against the run, but bites on play action versus, a guy like at the end of his career, a really good player at not biting on play action was Devin White. But Devin White was also, flowed kind of slow against the run. So there was this really cool interaction there. If you want to preprint, just DM me on Twitter. I've sent a few out this week. A lot of NFL teams have asked for it. That's a really really cool piece of work by Tage. I'm really proud of Tage. That's Tage's first publication as well, which is awesome. One of the best and brightest people in sports analytics, let alone football analytics. So that was a good one. Before I talk a little bit more about play action, I want to talk about Manscaped. This weekend is Father's Day. You are going to want to get your father or your husband or your friend or yourself. Again, my dad listens to the show. He did not let that one go in vain. My dad used to buy gifts for himself for Father's Day and for Christmas. That's awesome. If that's your prerogative, frankly. But with the promo code SUMER at manscaped.com, you can get 20% off all of the tools for your family jewels at Manscaped. Go ahead and use the Sumer Sports promo code SUMER, SUMER, to get yourself a weed whacker. What I use, look, my hair is flowing a little bit nice. I'm letting it grow out a little bit for the summer, but I do not let my nose hairs, my ear hairs, I do not let them grow out. I try to take care of myself there. Manscaped allows me to do that. The Lawnmower 4.0, 4th generation shaver for below the belt. That's there for you as well. Look, we got to normalize male grooming, and Manscaped helps you do that. And with SumerSports, you can get 20% off with promo code SUMER. So, last thing I want to talk about is, I love this. I love George. Matt Harmon had George Kittle on. Steven Ruiz, I believe, had George Kittle on. I love NFL players who are not afraid to talk to media about the nitty-gritty of the game, because football is such I just showed you guys, we looked at, XY tracking data in shoulder pads and looked at how linebackers bit on play action versus how they ran against the run. This is cool stuff, right? The NFL is a look into the soul of sport and of competition and all that. And so I love when guys like Austin Eckler and George Kittle and some of these really, really interesting players go and talk about the game. And Kittle, I think he said it to Steven Ruiz and Kevin Clark of The Ringer, but Kevin, good friend, really fantastic journalist and just an amazing guy. And he said that Kyle Shanahan will sometimes run plays that he knows don't work, just so that he can set up play action on later downs. And in fact, my old colleague at PFF, a guy who, it's funny, Deontay Lee and I almost never saw eye to eye on football. He's a great guy, but we came at it different perspectives. And I remember him during the Super Bowl when the Rams were playing the Bengals, kind of tweeting out look, all these run plays that the Rams are running, and somebody this is before I was at Sumer and I couldn't bet, I had a lot of money on Cam Akers under. And there's all these Cam Akers runs are setting something up. They're there to look at the safeties. And I'm thinking to myself, how many times you need to see how the safeties play the run? Maybe once or twice, not every first down and 10. So you get 2nd and 13. But Kittle kind of I think talked about what the football knowers were talking about there, which was they run plays to set up play action. So they'll run a run play that they know won't work so that they can set up a play later. And I thought to myself, okay, there's a few different ways. And, I'm an executive at at Sumer. And so I don't have a ton of time to do data analysis on the fly, but I did do some this week. And there's a couple other ways I want to address this, but I actually just wanted to look and see okay, let's look at first down success and let's look at second down success. Because in theory, second down success for a team like the 49ers who's deploying this strategy should be higher than expected, right? So let's go ahead and look at let's look at success rate first. So success rate, just to give you guys a little bit of an idea, and I know My good friend Ron Yurko will say, well, the cutoff is a little arbitrary. But basically, when we say success rate, we mean expected points added is more than 0. So you got closer to scoring. So there, generally speaking, on the average 1st and 10, you need to have 5 yards to be called successful. On 3rd and 1, you need 1 or more yards to be successful. On 4th and 1, you need 1 or more yards to be successful. On 2nd down, this is not quite true, and this is where guys like Warren Sharp fall short a little bit in their analysis. It's basically half of the remaining yards on 2nd down. So think about 5 yards on 1st down, about half the yards remaining on 2nd down, and then conversion on 3rd and 4th down. That's what success rate. That's what success is. This is the rate of success. And you look at this, and obviously this is a Mahomes graph because the Chiefs are in the upper right corner. Sorry, I literally made these the hour before this show, so that aspect ratios and all that are kind of a little bit bumped. But that line, that blue line, is basically like what you would expect on X if you were Y, or vice versa. And notice here, this is interesting because San Francisco actually is less successful on 2nd down than you would expect given their 1st down success rate. Now, again, the caveats apply here. You're not just setting up the 2nd down play with your 1st down run, right? So this is not perfect, right? And there's another way to look at it. I don't want to reveal how I'm going to do that because I'd like to make it into an article, but this is kind of a proxy in sort of getting to what I'm thinking about here, which is to say, if you're the Niners, you're more willing to dump 1st down plays to provide more of an opportunity on 2nd down to have huge success. And just looking at this lens here, this Boolean variable of success, 0-1, it's not supported by in terms of San Francisco in this regard. Now, however, and this is a characteristic of the Shanahan offense. If you look at expected points added, now expected points added is a little bit different than success rate. They're similar, but expected points added is basically, okay, how many points does this play gain? And points are less bounded, of course, than a Boolean variable like success at 0-1. The Niners generate more EPA on 2nd down than what you would expect from their 1st down EPA. So the Niners are not necessarily more successful on their sort of subsequent plays relative to their 1st down plays, but they are more explosive. And that is, I think, where they're getting at. Where if you look at the Niners run game, and this was true when they made the Super Bowl against the Chiefs. I remember being on Radio Row talking about how they had a really, really explosive run game. You think about Raheem Mostert taking a 3rd and 8 against the Packers in the NFC title game for a touchdown from like 40 yards out. You think about, but play for play, they're not particularly successful. They get stopped for negative yardage a lot. They get stopped for unsuccessful plays a lot, but they do bust a lot of plays, whether that be long runs or boot action stuff to Kittle, all these explosive plays. So and again, this is an incomplete, and when people watch this later, this is an incomplete view on, look into this hypothesis. But the Niners are more explosive on 2nd down plays than you would expect for them to be given their 1st down rate. So they're not more successful. They are more explosive, however, which I think so we can partially corroborate what George Kittle says there. In that Kevin Clark and Stephen Ruiz interview, which again was a really cool look into some of the things that the NFL is trying to do here with some like just having I think really intelligent, like a lot of these guys are really intelligent, and I don't just mean that from the tight end, because tight end you have to know the blocking, you have to know the receiving, so it does give rise to smarter players. I think Kittle, that was an incredible interview. I thought that was a really cool thing for him to say, and I like that they're more open with us. Before I get to questions from the listeners, so just drop your questions in the chat before we go here. I'm going to talk a little bit because there is some football this week. There's been football all spring. We've been blessed since the last week of the NFL season. The following week, we got XFL. We got XFL for 10 weeks. There was a 2-week crossover between XFL and USFL. And now there's a 2-week crossover between CFL and USFL. So we've gotten football. I mean, we're #blessed. We have not had a week without football since the Super Bowl. And, I don't bet anymore, but I do handicap the games just because, well, for one, I just want to see like sort of if I'm reading these things properly. But we do have some games coming up this weekend. We have the Pittsburgh Maulers going up against New Jersey General. Pittsburgh is getting 3.5. If you are going to bet that game, I would bet Pittsburgh plus the 3.5. The winner of that game gets into the USFL playoffs. You have the Birmingham Stallions -4 against the Memphis Showboats. Birmingham is already clinched. I think Memphis +4. Memphis has a home field advantage, actually, in the USFL. They're a hub city. Memphis is one of those hubs. The Memphis team does show out there. So I think Memphis +4 is a great bet. New Orleans -4 at Houston. Now, Houston is playing. They aren't playing in Houston, so there's no home field advantage. I still would like Houston +4. And then there's a pick'em. This game is actually to make the playoffs again. The Philadelphia Stars, who were in the championship game. People don't know this. The Philadelphia/Baltimore Stars have been in every single USFL championship game that has ever existed. All 3 in the 80s, 2 as the Philadelphia Stars, 1 as the Baltimore Stars. And then last year they lost the championship to Birmingham. Their pick'em against the Michigan Panthers. This game is actually played in Detroit, so it is a home game for Michigan. I still like Case Cookus. I would take the Philadelphia Stars as a pick'em in that game. So those are some, if you want to get some action in on some football games, those to me feel like the right ones. Again, just been handicapping them sort of all year. I have friends who bet it. I think it'd be. I think those games have been entertaining. If you have nothing to do on Saturday and Sunday, very much advise people to watch those games. The CFL, we had a game last night, Ottawa versus Calgary. Calgary won and covered. We have some games going on tonight. We'll talk more CFL as the summer goes rise to. Okay, let's talk with A here. A asks, Eric, your number one untapped opportunity is trading for coaches. What is number 2? That's a great question. I like this. I like this a lot. I still think there's an edge to be had in 4th down decisions. I still think teams leave a lot of that on the table. I still think teams could do basic strategy in the draft a lot, which would be things like, look, I personally believe you would be in the top. You'd be 80th percentile team in the NFL drafting if all you did was pick the best player available or accept trade back offers from other teams. So that those are just picking dollar bills up off the ground. That's an untapped opportunity there. I think the last one, and this is one where I was really happy to see my favorite team, the Kansas City Chiefs, factor into this. I think having a player on your team who is a deep threat, who is not, how do I say this in a politically correct way, isn't arrogant enough to want the football every single week, I think is an edge. So obviously for the Chiefs, you think about Valdez-Scantling was a guy who came in and in the AFC title game, because of injuries, because he had to switch roles a little bit, he caught 6 passes for 116 yards and a touchdown. Great game. Plays in the Super Bowl, gets 1 target, doesn't catch a pass. Wins the Super Bowl. None of us remember none of us remember the differences between those 2 games. Having your best wide receiver be your deep threat, I think is a hard way to go about it. I think having a deep threat on your team, a John Ross type, a Marquez Valdez-Scantling type, a Will Fuller type, Jalen Hyatt type, I think that's an untapped edge. And I think that we need to start using things like tracking data, which this was part of my Sloan paper. This was one of the reasons I had, was pounding the table for a team to sign Valdez-Scantling last year. I think we need to have better ways of measuring how field stretchers affect the game of football. And we need to value that position more, because you look at like Travis Kelce went from, he averaged like a yard more per target in 2022 than he did in 21. He was way more productive. And it's because he didn't have to, there was the deep threat on the Chiefs, because he was being paid so much and Tyreek Hill was clogging up the middle of the field where Kelce was. You take that guy away and you replace him with a much worse player in some, but you open up the field. And I think that's, it's much like basketball, where you need to have every role fulfilled at all times in the receiving core. And I just don't know if we're as good as we need to be at measuring how good field stretchers are in the NFL. And so that's an untapped opportunity, I think, which will play into a lot of things like the running game and all that kind of stuff in a very a real way. We got David Nelson here. The NFL draft is so much fun. I missed the whole run up to it. I would too, man. And I think draft betting was such a big part of my investments, over the last 2-3 years before this year. It's funny because actually I had way more. Well, of course, this is why I couldn't bet, but I had way more inside information this year than I ever would have. But it's such an interesting gambling opportunity too. And I think, during the pandemic, when there was nothing else to bet on but like Madden simulations and KBO baseball and all that stuff, it was a truly great gambling event. I don't think it's become a better gambling event because these books have gotten gun shy because, it's a much easier to get an edge that way. But yeah, it's a great event. And I think that's one of the reasons why football simply won't go away from it. And it's part of this thing where, I've talked about this a number of times on the show. We have, football is a violent game. Football is just on the edge of what's societally acceptable. And so it's why Roger Goodell makes 50 to 60 to 70 million a year. He's got to be able to make football a game that's good for labor, but also good for entertainment so that we don't, and so it's really hard. And I think that's, I'm just throwing it out there. I don't think they'll ever get rid of the draft, but I think that the draft is the main reason why we have the draft and everything with it, the rookie contracts and everything. Are why we have what we have in terms of running back, tight end, linebacker, all those values being somewhat suppressed in the NFL, especially for the truly elite players. Colin, who's one of my favorites, well done. I think describing the 49ers thing. Well, I appreciate that. I hope to give a more thorough analysis, but I was sort of whipping that up, trying to give you guys the best show possible. A says, great answer. Thanks, Eric. Misspelled my name. I won't put it up on the board, but we appreciate that. Yeah, it's a good question. There's a ton of things I think about the NFL on a daily basis. And to me, I think of, this is a really good book. I want to plug. I think it was Joe Prada who wrote Spaced Out, a basketball book. Also, one of my friends, Seth Partnow, wrote The Mid-Range Game. I've learned a lot about football just by reading about basketball and kind of how the complementary roles are. I think wide, receivers as well as the defensive backfield, you have to sort of think about it in a basketball sense. And it really, I think, opens up the perspective, at least for me. So, cool. Seeing no other questions, I'm going to let everybody go. But before I do so, appreciate you all coming. Please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. Please go to SumerSports.com, sign up for our sign, put your email into our sign up. We're going to start sending out newsletters fairly quickly, but be one of the first, I don't know what we're going to call this, Sumerians, members of Club Sumer. I don't know what we're going to end up calling it. I think we're going to call listeners to this podcast. I'm going to make that unilateral decision, even though Thomas hasn't been here and Parker has been filling in for him admirably. I think we're going to call them the Good Sumerians. Per Matt, I think it was Matt Ungeshenk that gave that suggestion. I'm going to go with it. So for all the Good Sumerians here, really appreciate you coming. Again, tell somebody about this show. We will have timestamps up today as well. So for Eric Eager, this has been episode 68 of the SumerSports Show. We thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next week.